Célio Turino, who's a historian, a writer, a politician and a policymaker. He was the Secretary of Cultural Citizenship for Brazil's Ministry of Culture from 2004 to 2010 and the architect of the projects that are discussed and captured in this book, which I hope many of you have seen, The Point of Culture. We will then hear from Paul Heritage. Paul is Professor of Drama and Performance at Queen Mary University of London, and he is Director of People's Palace Projects. He's worked extensively on human rights in prisons, using performance as his methodology. And as a producer, he's worked with some of the UK's leading arts institutions to bring a range of Brazilian artists to British audiences. He's authored many publications on theatre and on Brazil, and obviously one of the editors of this collection as well today. He, as is not unusual, is in Brazil, so he will be talking to us through a video that he has already prepared. And then finally, Moira Sinclair, am I right? Moira is the Executive Director for National Strategy and London and the South East at Arts Council England. That's right, It'll do. She has been over the years responsible for the support and development of the arts throughout London, overseeing many regularly funded organisations and also working closely with a whole variety of different arts agencies in London, and was particularly, I think, involved in preparations for London 2012. And before joining the Arts Council, she was Director of Vital Arts. So, Célio, it would be great if you could now talk to us about the points of culture, and we will obviously be having translation as well, so Célio will be... Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Obrigado. Vou falar em português.
So I'll speak in Portuguese.
Antes gostaria de deixar alguns agradecimentos especiais.
I'd like to give some thank yous to someone.
Em 2010 eu estive aqui em Londres e mantive um encontro com o Andrew na Gulbenkian.
2010 I have been here in London and I had this meeting with Andrew.
E fui muito bem recebido, não somente aqui, como em todo o Reino Unido e sobretudo pelo governo do Reino Unido.
And I felt very welcome here in the UK, not only here in the Gulbenkian, but also with the government and everywhere I went in the UK.
Junto com Moira,
with Moira,
Arts Council, e com vários artistas que puderam realizar intercâmbio no Brasil, com grupos culturais.
Arts that after came to Brazil to create exchanges with cultural groups,
Cultura.
with points of culture as we have there.
Naquele momento pensamos na tradução do meu livro do português para o inglês.
And then we started thinking about this translation of my book to English.
E agora está cá um resumo do livro, mas que ontem à noite eu pude ler e fiquei muito satisfeito e gostaria de deixar um agradecimento especial.
And now we have this book, which is most of the book that I wrote is now in English, and I have read it yesterday. I was very satisfied with the results.
Ao meu amigo Paul, que está no Brasil.
I wanted to thank first Paul, a friend who is in Brazil.
Também a Rosie and Poppy, que organizaram e editaram o livro.
Also Rosie and Poppy, who organized and edited the book with him.
A Thiago, que já um amigo brasileiro que está aqui há vários anos.
With a Brazilian friend who is here for many years.
E a André, que é da minha cidade.
And Andrew, who is from the same city as I am.
Mas prefiro falar em pé.
But I prefer to speak standing.
Okay.
Me too.
O que é um ponto de cultura?
So what is a point of culture?
É um conceito matemático.
It's actually a mathematical concept.
Tudo começa com um ponto, os pontos vão se compondo, constroem linhas e pensamentos.
Everything starts with a point. All the points, they compose things, they build lines and then thoughts.
E assim construímos uma política pública para a cultura, a partir de um conceito matemático.
And then that's how we created a public policy for culture, from a mathematical concept.
E por que foi necessário agir assim? Porque a cultura envolve as mais diversas identidades.
We had to approach it like that because culture has many different identities in it.
E a cultura carrega dentro dela diversas ambiguidades.
And there are many ambiguities inside culture as well.
Cultura é ao mesmo tempo preservação
It is about preservation
e invenção,
and at the same time innovation.
continuidade e ruptura.
Continuity and change.
Em nosso país, por um longo tempo, uma série de grupos comunitários têm trabalhado para reforçar as suas identidades.
In Brazil, for a long time, a wide number of community groups have worked for reinforce their identities.
Creio que não no Brasil, mas a gente de todo mundo
Not
tem
only in Brazil, but people from everywhere have
fortalecido
tried
suas
to
identidades.
strengthen their identities.
E isso é muito importante, porque sem a identidade as pessoas não têm um piso firme para se projetarem para adiante.
And it's very important because without a strong identity, people don't have a strong ground to think forward.
Sem saber quem são, se auto-reconhecer.
If they don't know who they are, if they cannot recognize themselves, it's difficult.
Todavia é insuficiente.
But it's not enough.
É necessário que as pessoas também se reconheçam no outro,
It's important that people also identify themselves on others,
por mais diferente que seja.
even if they are very different from each other.
Por isso a matemática.
So that's why the math.
Porque a matemática não entra na subjetividade. Ela consegue condensar os nossos pontos em comum.
Because mathematics is not about subjectivity. It can kind of put together what we have in common.
E assim fizemos, com 3.500 pontos de cultura no Brasil, para 9 milhões de pessoas, em 1.100 municípios.
So that's what we did for 3,500 points of culture.
Para 9 milhões de
For
pessoas,
9 million people
em 1.100 municípios.
and 1,100 municipalities in Brazil.
O Brasil, como sabem, é um país
You know, Brazil is a very big country.
grande, não é? Desde cineastas indígenas,
From indigenous filmmakers
que produzem seus filmes como editores, como diretores, como atores, colocam a sua história na sua própria voz, no seu próprio idioma.
from indigenous filmmakers who work who produce and have produced their films as directors, actors, and editors, using their own voice to produce them.
Notem, não é uma ação de fora para dentro, mas de dentro para fora.
It's
É
not
o índio pelo índio.
It's not an outside-in operation. It's the indigenous person talking about themselves.
E não o indígena, mas os 180 povos indígenas do Brasil, cada qual com sua cultura, com seu idioma, seu tronco linguístico.
And not the indigenous people in general, but there are 180 different tribes of indigenous people in Brazil, each one with their language, with their identity.
Não todos, 180, mas já
Maybe not the
alcançamos
whole
uns 20
180,
ou 30.
but maybe 20 or 30
Sim.
of them.
Ou os jovens das favelas,
And young people from the favelas,
se unindo com grupos experimentais das universidades,
working with experimental groups from universities,
artistas contemporâneos,
with contemporary artists as well,
com grupos de artes de trabalhadores sem terra,
with how do you say that, landless?
não landers,
No landers, yeah.
são camponeses.
Malaysia, people
It's
who work in the
people
land.
without
Yeah.
their ownership of the
Yeah.
We
land.
still call it Movimento Sem Terra.
Sinclair.
Sinclair.
Oh, Sinclair,
Okay.
yeah, this is for
É,
sure. Yeah, they have experimental arts groups there.
constituímos 200 grupos de teatro
So
nessa
200
área,
theater companies were created in this area as well.
retratando sua realidade, mas não a partir de uma experiência única, mas intercambiando, desde Shakespeare, Brecht, autores franceses e a tradição da cultura popular brasileira.
From Shakespeare to popular Brazilian culture, Brecht and other things.
E assim fomos produzindo um processo de interações estéticas.
And then we created this process of aesthetics interactions.
Não para que o criador único apresente seu trabalho, mas que forme as pessoas para que elas realizem um produto artístico.
not only thinking that this original artist, creator, would present his work to audiences or teach them how to do it,
mas que ele resulte em uma criação nova, uma criação única.
but that innovation is created from their working together.
Que una exatamente a tradição com a invenção.
And then that's something that would unite innovation and tradition.
Exemplo.
So one example.
Os afrodescendentes no Brasil.
So Afro-descendants in Brazil,
Quando do período da escravidão, os navios negreiros eles encontravam nos portos da costa da África algumas pessoas que estranhas.
during the slavery period, the ships who came with slaves, they went to Africa, and these people who went there in the ships, they met some strange people.
Quem eram essas pessoas?
Who were these people?
Eram os gritadores.
They were called shouters.
Eram homens que gritavam loucamente para que aquelas pessoas que estavam sendo aprisionadas, que seriam levadas para a escravidão,
They were people who shouted. They shouted very strongly towards those people who were being taken as slaves.
contavam as suas histórias, cantavam, se pintavam, e os negreiros os respeitavam, não os escravizavam.
And they told their stories, they sang, they created visual images with
Porque
themselves.
acreditavam que eram mágicos.
And the people taking people as slaves respected them. They didn't took them to be slaves initially,
E eram mágicos.
because they thought they were magicians, and they were.
Eram os portadores da memória daqueles povos.
They empowered the memory of those people who were being taken as slaves.
A estas pessoas os portugueses deram o nome de gritadores.
And the Portuguese at the time gave the name shouters to these people.
Gritadores foi a origem da palavra em francês griot.
And that was the origin of the word in French, griot.
São as pessoas que transmitiam a cultura pela oralidade.
So it became in the end the person who transmitted their culture through speaking them.
E que se
words.
transportou para a América também.
And this tradition was transported to America as well.
E se estabeleceu uma linha de transmissão de cultura por séculos e séculos.
And for centuries and centuries, there was this link of a way of transmitting the stories and the memory, the culture.
Com os pontos de cultura e a cultura viva, recuperamos o trabalho destes griots.
So the work of these griots, called griots, we kind of recover the work that they did,
Aproximando-os da escola pública e da criação artística.
putting them close to the public school and also from creating art.
E restabelecendo vínculos intergeracionais também.
And also establishing intergenerational links between them.
E assim buscamos fazer uma imensa teia, um imenso encontro. O Andrew esteve na teia em 2010, não?
And then we created this big meeting we were called Network. Andrew was there in 2010? In 2010, wasn't he?
Realizamos 4 como aquela.
We created 4 like those.
Milhares de pessoas
10,000 of people.
das mais diversas origens, de cineastas indígenas a mestres da cultura tradicional, com artistas contemporâneos, com jovens das favelas, das ruas.
And these 1,000 people from indigenous filmmakers or contemporary artists and young people from the favelas and musicians and others.
E assim foi se estabelecer.
And that's how we created it.
Pouco eu conto no livro.
Some of it you can read in the book.
Mas também não é manter a cultura no seu dentro das pessoas, mas é estabelecer um processo de diálogo.
But not keeping the culture within the people, but creating dialogues.
Imagine assim.
So if you imagine,
A, B, C, D, E. Ok? Um ponto de cultura indígena,
this is a point of culture for indigenous people.
de hip hop,
hip hop,
trabalhando com software livre.
People who work with free software.
Assim, o software livre é um componente muito importante na construção dos pontos de cultura.
Free software is a very important component of building the points of culture.
Não somente pelo aspecto tecnológico, mas sobretudo do ponto de vista filosófico.
Not only for the technical aspect, but also philosophical aspect as well.
Porque é a busca do ponto comum.
Because it's the search for a common point.
E assim, um outro de arte contemporânea, enfim.
You can have another one for contemporary arts and so on.
O que nós buscamos não foi manter o grupo dentro da sua produção cultural.
What we're trying to do is not to keep this group inside their own cultural production,
Mas integrá-los.
but integrate them
Assim,
like this.
aprendemos na escola primária.
You know it from very early ages in school.
Percebem? A, B, C, D, E. Percebem que acá não há mais A,
So in this space there is no A anymore.
A, B, B. E assim sucessivamente. São essas intersecções
Some of these intersections,
que produzem processos novos de criação.
they produce innovative process, creative process.
Mas também não é assim, porque a cultura não é plana.
But it's not all
A vida não é plana.
it's not only like that, because it's not about being only straightforward as
Um processo
and life is not like that.
mais próximo seria esse,
A representation more accurate would be this one.
tridimensional,
But it could have to be three-dimensional,
como o nosso cérebro,
like our brain.
que vai produzindo diversos pontos de intersecção.
And you create many intersection points.
Por exemplo, com o hip hop, no rap.
For example, with hip hop.
Rap é ritmo e poesia.
Rap is rhythm and poetry.
Mas na cultura tradicional e popular, há uma série de expressões a partir do ritmo e da poesia.
But in the traditional popular culture in Brazil, there are many expressions of culture with poetry and rhythm.
Que tem origem na Península Ibérica.
And the origin is in the Iberic Peninsula.
E por vezes, grupos de jovens que se identificam com o rap como uma linguagem mundial dos jovens das periferias do mundo, se redescobrem ao perceber que seus avós também faziam rap.
So many times young people who identify themselves with rap, they reinvent themselves when they learn that their grandmothers and grandfathers also did some kind of rap.
Seria o cordel,
Could be cordel,
que é uma forma de
which is
literatura,
a form of Brazilian literature,
ou o repente,
or repente,
são histórias cantadas como rap,
which is about singing stories.
e assim produzem algo novo, o rap repente.
And then they can produce something new, like the repente rap.
Mas voltando um pouco a cá, até porque creio que temos pouco tempo, né?
Just to come back
Por
from
favor,
the beginning, we have a little bit of time, so please tell me.
A nossa busca é pelo fortalecimento da autonomia,
So our search is for the strengthening of autonomy,
de forma que, como no exemplo com cineastas indígenas,
for example, with using the same example with the indigenous filmmakers.
a intenção é que na selva o indígena tenha esta máquina.
The intention is that in the jungle in Brazil, an indigenous person could have a machine like that one.
Com os Axaninca na fronteira com o Peru, eles editam nesta máquina.
Axalinca, which is indigenous people in the border with Peru, they edit what they do
Na própria máquina.
within the camera.
E tenham os seus computadores como ilha de edição.
And also, they have the computers to edit it as well.
Aliás, para quem trabalha com gestão cultural e em grupos mais remotos, a autonomia é fundamental nesse processo tecnológico.
For those who work with people who live in remote cultural groups who work in remote parts of the country, it's very important to give them autonomy.
Até pelo custo,
Especially because of the cost as well.
porque por vezes um equipamento ele deixa de ser utilizado por um problema simples. e a assistência técnica seria muito cara.
Sometimes you have an equipment with a problem and it's difficult to replace it, but you can fix it with very simple technology.
Mas sobretudo porque a intenção é que a tecnologia sirva à vida e não a vida servindo à tecnologia.
But above all, because you want technology to serve life and not life to serve technology.
Outra busca
Another search
é o protagonismo.
is about protagonism.
As pessoas falando na primeira voz,
People speaking for themselves
criando
first person.
por elas.
And creating by themselves.
Como isso se concretizou em gestão pública? Cada ponto recebe $25 mil por ano.
And we did that as management or public policy, giving $25,000 each year for each ponto de cultura.
E esses 3 mil
For these 3,000 pontos de cultura.
e são selecionados a partir do seu próprio projeto.
They're elected by their project.
É o oposto do que do que o Brasil praticava há 10 anos.
It was the opposite that Brazil was doing 10 years before.
É muito comum o gestor público imaginar que tem a solução para todos os problemas das pessoas.
It's very common that the policymaker thinks that they have the solution for the problems of everyone else doing culture.
Nós invertemos.
But we inverted this.
Dissemos o que poderíamos dispor, o que teríamos,
We said what we had and what we could put on the table.
e as pessoas disseram como dariam a solução.
And they told us how they would create solutions for what they wanted to do.
Em alguns lugares por bibliotecas comunitárias,
Some places was about community libraries.
de tal maneira que cada ponto é diferente do outro.
So each point of culture is different from each other.
Mas eles têm um ponto em comum,
But they have something in common,
que é a busca dessa integração em rede,
which is seeking this integration as a network.
que está construindo uma inteligência coletiva.
And maybe creating a kind of collective intelligence.
De tal maneira que um ponto poderia ser definido assim.
And we could then define a point of culture like this.
Eu fiz isso quando comecei a viajar por alguns países,
I did this when I started traveling to some
e a
countries.
linguagem matemática é
And mathematics
universal.
was easy to communicate, was universal.
A, P,
We had
E de autonomy,
A from autonomy, P for
P.
protagonism.
protagonismo. Assim, ponto de cultura seria isso.
So point of culture is,
Neste estágio, mas não é assim.
but it's not exactly like that.
A elevação à potência das redes.
We have the potential of the networks there.
Ok? Da cá a cá. Porque o grande problema do mundo é a busca da coesão.
Because the big problem in the world is cohesion.
E cada vez não encontramos esses pontos em comuns. Cada vez nos distanciamos mais.
And we struggle to find these points in common. We, most of the time, become more distant from each other.
Mesmo agora, no Brasil, vocês devem ter acompanhado os movimentos em que o povo brasileiro foi às ruas contra a Copa do Mundo.
You may have heard that recently Brazilian people have come to go to the streets against the World Cup.
Como poderíamos imaginar algo assim?
How could you ever imagine something like that?
O Brasil é o país do futebol.
We are the football country,
E a gente se revoltou contra o futebol.
and we will be rebellious against football.
Mas não foi contra o
But
futebol.
of course, it wasn't against football itself.
Foi contra o não entendimento. Em um país, sobretudo, que cresceu muito nos últimos anos, mas que manteve diferenças muito profundas.
It was about the lack of understanding in a country which had produced a lot of wealth in the recent years, but there was a lot of inequality.
Agora mesmo, em minha viagem para cá, está havendo um novo fenômeno no Brasil,
When I was coming here, I was noticing that there was a new phenomenon in Brazil,
chamado de rolezinhos.
what they call rolezinho.
São encontros de jovens pobres das periferias em shopping centers.
So these young people from the peripheries, they set up meetings in the shopping centers.
5.000, 10.000 jovens
They go
dentro
like
de um shopping.
5,000 young people or 10,000, they set up in the networks.
Neste domingo, a polícia reprimiu esses jovens dentro de um shopping, com bombas e cacetetes.
Last Sunday, the police have repressed this movement, the young people going to the shopping centers with bombs and stickers.
Entre ontem e hoje, há mais 20 rolezinhos em shopping centers pelo Brasil, agendados agora.
And now, just because of that, there are more 20 of them set up in the whole
Algo
Brazil
estranho.
for next weekend.
As pessoas fazendo protesto para frequentar shopping center.
It's really weird when people have to protest to be able to go to a shopping center.
Mas eu me recordo que aqui em Londres, há 3 ou 4 anos,
But I also remind that here in London, 3 or 4 years ago,
ocorreu a mesma
they
coisa.
had kind of the same thing.
Há algum tempo eu imaginava que a revolução seria feita por outros motivos. Essa é a busca da ação comunicativa.
That's the seeking of the action that can communicate.
Entre povos diferentes, entre gerações diferentes, formas de expressão diferentes.
Between people of generations and different ways of expression.
Mas se não conseguirmos exercitar a nossa capacidade de nos reconhecer no outro,
But if we can't practice our capacity of recognize ourselves in others,
o que seria a alteridade, o se perceber no outro,
which is the word in Portuguese, alteridade,
Alteridade.
authority is the word in English,
Ok.
but it's the being able to empathize with
Dominam
others
o
instead of
conceito.
yourself.
Porque trabalhamos muito com o conceito de identidade,
This
não
is the
é? Eu
concept,
por
because
dentro.
We talk a lot about identity, but not about
Sou eu
authority.
e você, e você.
I talk about
Mas há que ter um esforço para estabelecer este reconhecimento e esta subjetividade também.
we have to do an effort to create this recognition in the other, not only on our own identity.
E a única liga para que nós consigamos aproximar a identidade, sair da identidade e encontrar a alteridade, continuando sendo nós mesmos,
And the only way we can link these two things, like going from identity to finding authority, but still being who we are,
é a arte.
is art.
Era isso.
Good afternoon from Rio de Janeiro, and thank you to the Gulbenkian Foundation, and in particular to Andrew Barnett, for the invitation that he made to Célio Turino 2 years ago to publish his book in English. I'd like particularly to thank Felicity and Oscar, our editorial assistants from the Gulbenkian, who've made it possible for Rosie, Poppy and myself to edit this book and to bring it to fruition this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Margaret Bolton, who has been responsible for putting together this seminar, and of course to thank the Gulbenkian for making it possible that I can participate with you this afternoon. Being here in Rio de Janeiro while Célio Turino is there with you in London is in many respects a reflection of the process that's at the heart of this book, which is in itself an inversion, a way of changing perspectives so we can look from the other side, in Célio's words, to look from the bottom up, or in the subtitle we chose, Brazil turned upside down. The book itself is perhaps a reminder of how we need different voices to be heard in the making of that cultural policy. One of the fascinating things for me when I first read the original book in Portuguese was to see how Célio allowed us to hear so many individual people across the pages. From the voice of Darlene in Paraná, who as a mother created a cultural centre in an abandoned public building to enable young people from her community to take part in activities such as crochet, belly dancing, theatre, percussion, through to the, if you like, the official voice of Wellington Dias, the governor of Pará, and of course the voice of Wansu, one of the 5 old women who is still fluent in the language of the Yawalapiti tribe. I was captivated by how, in addition to these diverse Brazilian voices from the Pontos de Cultura program itself, Célio had also added a range of different voices in the way in which he wrote as Célio. We hear the voice of Célio as Secretary of Cultural Citizenship, who devised this program and developed it over the 10 years. And you can read in the book the detailed, intricate interconnectedness of how this policy was developed. But we also hear the, if you like, the internal, poetic voice of Célio as he describes the impact of the program, as he travels and meets people from the placid margins of the river Ipiranga to the peripheries of Brazil's great cities, along that coastline of the northeast, through the different riverside communities of the Amazon, from digital art centers to indigenous villages. We meet, we hear, we experience the way in which the Pontos de Cultura program has come about. But we're not able to just hear about the program and to read about it. We're also about to see it through the range of photographs that the Gulbenkian Foundation has allowed us to include in this English version of the book. We chose 2 photographers to represent the program, and for very distinct reasons. One of the photographers is Tete Catalan, who was the Secretary of Cultural Citizenship after Célio Turino, who continued the development of the program, and is also an artist, a photographer, just as Gilberto Gil, the Minister of Culture, was a musician. And the other photographer we chose is Ratão Diniz, who's a young photographer born in the favela of Maré in Rio de Janeiro, who learnt his craft, his art, within one of the projects that became a Pontos de Cultura. So he's very much a living proof of the success of the program. And it's through the eyes of these 2 photographers that we are taken into the detail, not only of the program, but you also see some of the English artists who have visited that program over the last 4 years. But what can this book say to us in the UK? The Pontos de Cultura program is, as Andrew Barnett says in his introduction, an inspiration. This English language of the version of the book seeks to bring some of that original inspiration together with a dialogue that comes from the UK practitioners that have engaged with it. But it is not a book of methodologies, nor is it a recipe book for how to make cultural policy. It hopes to be a book that suggests there are other ways of thinking about cultural policy and arts practices other than the ones with which we have become familiar, naturalized. But there are 2 aspects that concern the Pontos de Cultura program in Brazil that I want to emphasize in order to help us reflect on the potential learning within a UK context. The first is, this is not Brazil's only cultural policy or arts funding program. Brazil has a very strong European, African, indigenous patrimony to maintain and develop buildings, research institutions, arts practices, artists, tangible and intangible cultural heritage. It also has to support a dynamic audiovisual industry, the National Library, to send Brazilian artists to international festivals, to develop individual artistic languages, aesthetic forms, all the range of activities you'd expect from a Minister of Culture. The Pontos de Cultura program is not a replacement for those activities. It is perhaps a rethinking, a rebalancing of the Ministry of Culture's focus. And the second point I want to make about the original Pontos de Cultura program is that it was implemented by Gilberto Gil as Minister of Culture, who invited Célio Turino to devise the original program. And it was devised as part of a range of social programs within the first Lula presidency in 2003. Fome Zero, Bolsa Familia are the parts of that program the most commented on internationally, but as part of a range of programs that lifted millions of Brazilians from absolute poverty. Pontos de Cultura is as much a sister program within this radical social agenda as it is another funding program within the Ministry of Culture. And that is something that over the 10 years of the evolution of the program, Célio Turino was able to develop, looking both ways, both towards the other aesthetic art form development programs within the Ministry of Culture and increasing the connectivity with the programs within the wider social agenda. Both within the program and within the book, that is, I think, a well-developed idea. And perhaps that is a way in which we can start to raise the questions about what this program might stimulate as a dialogue with the UK. And perhaps this helps us to raise the essential questions back to us in the UK. How do we balance the need for effective funding which guarantees the rich, diverse cultural heritage of the United Kingdom, while stimulating new creativity and evolving artistic practices and languages that reach across the regions, as well as guaranteeing the right to cultural activity for everyone? How to ensure that our cultural policies and programs interconnect with wider governmental and social actions. I know that Moira Sinclair, who follows, will have strong persuasive arguments to each of these points, as will many of you in the audience this afternoon. And it is in that dialogue between artists, policymakers, between government and non-government institutions, between academics, communities, audiences, and as well as, I hope, between Brazil and the UK. It is in these dialogues that we hope to discover the new ideas, the new initiatives, the new points to our culture. Over the last 4 years, People's Palace Projects has had the honour and the privilege to produce a programme known as Points of Contact, which is a set of cultural exchange activities between the UK and Brazil based on the Pontos de Cultura programme. It's become part of the wider British Council Transform programme and is funded by the Arts Council England. It enables artists from both Brazil and the UK, together with policymakers, to exchange ideas, to visit each other's projects, and has enabled nearly 200 of these arts organisations and individuals to exchange over these last 4 years. It also means that the work they've created and collaborated on has reached out to 1,000 members of all sorts of different communities and audiences. We hope the book expanded in its English language edition to include testimonies from the UK artists that participated in the Points of Contact programme. We hope this book will continue to stimulate those dialogues and those creative collaborations. But before I hand over to Moira, I'd just like to turn to the final section of the book, which is called Points Forward. It describes itself as a manifesto because it was written by the 20 artists who visited Brazil on the first year of the exchange program and who had just come back from Brazil and then hosted a set of 30 artists and policymakers from Brazil. One night on the final weekend of the program, the UK artists got together and decided to write a set of declarations. And I use that word because, as you'll hear, there is a heightened rhetoric to the way these ideas are expressed. And they wrote what they chose to describe as a manifesto. There are 10 declarations, and I think that each of them, in their way, is still relevant, still in play, although many of them have been addressed both by these artists and institutions as well as by the Arts Council itself. And I just want to finish by reading the final declaration, because I think it has the most to say to us here this afternoon. We reaffirm the importance of international cultural exchange based on shared learning and creative collaboration to ensure that the UK remains an evolving nation of diverse, shifting cultures, drawing inspiration and energy from outside ourselves. Thank you.
just want to reflect a little bit on how I met them, actually, because I think that's quite important in this context. I've known of Paul Heritage and his work at People's Palace for some considerable time. As Morag said, I was a community arts practitioner, and particularly in the context of my own work in East London, running Vital Arts, which was an arts and health programme based at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. I'd been convinced both about his practice, and I'd also been interested in his in-depth knowledge of what was happening in Brazil. Paul and I talked in 2005, before I started at the Arts Council, and as I embarked on the CLAW Leadership Programme, about my going to Brazil as part of the programme. In the end, I didn't get there, but the conversation arose because I decided to do some research and thinking about the relationship between cultural and social policy in the UK, post-1997 and the election of the Labour government. I've been looking at things like the Pat 10 reports, and some of us are old enough in this room to remember all of those days, and also the work of people like Francois Matarasso, who've been trying to define how you could express the value of culture in a social context. I've been informed by my own policy-making experience in local government, and I worked in South Bedfordshire, which is a particularly peculiar area of the country, and then by my practice at Vital Arts. Now, why am I telling you all that? I'm telling you all of that because when in 2009 Paul started to talk about this visionary man, Célio, and the innovative Pontos de Cultura programme, his words fell on pretty fertile ground, I think it's fair to say. It's why I think it's so important that policymakers have their roots in practice and continue to see and be engaged with artists and work once they're in post. And I think it's interesting all the way through this to think about the connectivity between personal experience and professional experience, and where those things come together in unusual places and make connections in unusual places. And actually the Arts Council has grappled with many of the same issues that Célio had identified for the entirety of its life. And certainly a number of the challenges he posed were ones that we were discussing regularly at the Executive Board table. The Arts Council's Royal Charter had been put in place to ensure that post-Second World War, and building on the SEMA programme, art continued to reach people. But whose art and which people had been part of the discourse practically since the day the Arts Council was established. We were established at arm's length from government. So in theory, we could be responsive to the needs of artists and communities without political stifling, and with the possibility of funding the subversive. And indeed, successive governments have complained we've done just that. But I think artists and certainly communities would comment on the length of the arm between the Arts Council and government, depending on which government and what time we're in. That arm has been shorter or longer, and that's been a challenge. The world had changed fundamentally, and our funding had changed in recognition of that change in the world. The Arts Council of Great Britain funded 15 organisations originally, opera and ballet and orchestras. By the time we were talking to Paul and listening to Célio, we funded 650 organisations on a regular basis. Many, but by no means all of them, did have deep roots in their local communities. We had an open application process as well, Grants for the Arts, which post the formation of the National Lottery was using lottery funds as grants for individuals, for arts organisations and for other people who use their arts in the work. This was largely demand-led, which recognises some of the circles that Célio is drawing. So it was by no means a picture that we were describing at that stage, which was all negative or not attempting to address some of the things that Célio had mentioned. But we were reflecting, and we still do, on how to recognise and fund artistic activities that previously existed outside of public funding initiatives. And I think that's as current today as it was then. And I think for many arts organisations that we talk to at the moment, they don't have the same models of production, the same models of existence that we're used to funding as a charitable funding organisation. I think we would all recognise that we struggle to create the bridges and networks between cultural and social initiatives. Actually, we struggle to create bridges and networks between cultural organisations, and for a small country, that does feel a peculiarity. And we struggle to develop all of those values that Célio has described: equality, cohesion. Communication is still a big challenge, I think, for us. And I think it's fair to say that we've recognised the tensions that Célio outlined, particularly between conservation and innovation. We have a proud cultural heritage and tradition in this country. Our funding is historically connected to that tradition. And to shift the balance of funding is rather like shifting the policy making potentially of the Arts Council. We're a big ocean liner, and it takes quite a while to turn us and to turn our funding to address the contemporary issues that we're talking about. So I'm very proud that the Arts Council was involved in funding this learning exchange programme, which People's Palace Productions have managed on our behalf and with us as partners. And I'm so pleased to see the outcomes to date of that investment. I don't think that I can claim that everything the Arts Council is doing now is entirely as a result of the Points of Contact programme. But it certainly had an influence, and as I said, it played into that fertile environment. These were issues we were already thinking about. And I think it was really important that policymakers as well as artists went on those trips. I think it's very difficult for artists on their own to have the kind of influence that they would want to have in this country at the moment. And the more that we can get both sides of the equation working together, the better. I hope that the model of funder, as Célio described it, at best as a know-it-all and at worst as a dictator, has shifted significantly in the last 5 to 7 years. And I just wanted to outline a few things which I think have been interesting in that context and we might want to pick up on. So the first is a Creative People and Places programme which the Arts Council launched. We wanted more people to experience and be inspired by the arts, and also to be part of that co-production, the sense that they are, I think Célio said, feeding into culture, not having culture placed on them. And that's a £37 million programme in a small number of locations across the country. It's establishing action research partnerships. There are all sorts of partners involved in that. Certainly artists are a key component of those programmes, but so is local government and so are many social enterprises, housing associations and the like. And what we're hoping is that it will be a long-term collaborative process. It aims to empower those collaborators to experiment with new and radically different approaches and to develop inspiring, sustainable arts programmes that will engage audiences in those communities into the future. It's a 3-year funded programme initially, but the intention is that that sits within a 10-year clear vision that everyone signed up to. And I think you can see some of the ways in which we're interpreting what Célio's been doing in Brazil in the context of a different climate here. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the strategic touring programme. That's a £45 million programme launched in 2011. And it was specifically designed to create collaboration between organisations so that more people across England could experience art and culture and inform the production of that arts and culture, that there were stronger relationships forged between those involved in artistic audience and programme development on both the supply side, i.e. the artists and producers, and also the demand side, the audiences and the promoters, and working out a different dialogue, a different set of relationships and connections there. We wanted to see a wide range of really high quality work on tour, but particularly work by and for children and young people, and particularly work by and for people from diverse backgrounds. I think that that programme has had some challenges in being placed into the world, but I think the intention behind it is absolutely to rethink, as Paul said, some of the ways in which those conversations and that dialogue takes place. The third area is the Arts Council's articulation of what it expects from its national portfolio organisations. Over the past 5 years, I think we've clarified a lot what we think it means to be part of that national portfolio. We talk about civic leadership nowadays, that those national portfolio organisations have a civic leadership role to play, not just an artistic leadership role to play. We've spoken about the need to connect with the public and the publics in a very different way. And we've supported and encouraged genuine co-production. And I can think of many examples, Theatre Royal Stratford in terms of its work with young people, and actually Janet's here from the Horniman Museum and hosted a fantastic project called Stories of the World, which had young people curating exhibitions in the main body of the museum. Very, very powerful, with an incredible attendance as a result of that. I spoke in Melbourne about those expectations at a conference in Australia, and at the end of my talk, which was to a group like this, somebody said, will you come and say that on television, please? And I said, yeah, sure, but why? And he said, because it's so radical here at the moment in Australia to have those kinds of expectations of major arts institutions, to expect them to be part of a dialogue with their local communities and to connect with their local communities. In the past, we've been funded, culture's been funded through grant in aid. It's come from government to the Arts Council. The balance is shifting and the lottery funding is becoming increasingly important as part of the conversation. And for me, I think there is a perception, if you're a member of the public, that you have more right to engage in a conversation about where lottery money is spent, because you're making a choice about that, a very obvious choice when you go into the shop. And to ensure that there is a genuine reach for our cultural programme, given that that lottery funding is becoming more important, is going to be part of the dialogue in the future. So I leave it there, and I think we're going to open it up to discussion.
How much does Célio think that the Brazilian mentality led to the success of this project, and does he think it can be replicated in other cultures?
Já tem 4 países que implantam os pontos de cultura.
There are 4 countries who have the points of culture nowadays.
Como política governamental.
As a governmental policy.
Argentina. E na Argentina, em 3 níveis. O governo federal, o governo da província de Buenos Aires e o governo da cidade de Buenos Aires.
In 3 levels, of the federal government, the provincial government and the municipality of Buenos Aires government as well.
Digo isso porque quem conhece a política da Argentina sabe quanto é radicalizada e quanto ela se dá por opostos.
If you know a policy in Argentina, you know how radicalized it is and how much opposition there is.
O governo da capital federal é oposição radical ao governo da nação.
So the federal government and the capital government are completely opposite parties.
E talvez este seja a única política pública que ambos governos aplicam.
And this is the only policy that both governments apply.
Também no Peru, a cidade de Lima e o Ministério da Cultura do Peru.
Also in Peru, the Federal Ministry of Culture and the government of the city of Lima.
Na Colômbia, há uma lei já implantada na cidade de Medellín.
In Colombia, in the city of Medellin, there is a law for the points of culture.
E também na cidade de Bogotá, como política pública do município de Bogotá.
And also in Bogotá, the municipality of Bogotá, the capital of Bolivia.
E também na Costa Rica, que sediará agora em abril o 6º Congresso Ibero-Americano de Cultura, que envolve a América Latina, mas Espanha e Portugal.
And also in Costa Rica there will be now the Congress. The Congress for Congresso de
Ibero-Americano.
For Iberian Latin American Culture Congress.
Também com a Península Ibérica, né?
So the Iberic Peninsula and the Latin America.
É congresso governamental.
It's a governmental congress.
Em que o tema exclusivo será a cultura viva e os pontos de cultura.
And the main theme will be the Points of Culture and the Cultura Viva program.
E há 11 países outros na América Latina com campanhas para a implantação dessa política.
And there are other 11 countries in Latin America also with campaigning for having this kind of policy.
Alongside that, I put radical question mark, socialism question mark, community activism question mark. When after we'd met Célio and we'd had a conversation and Paul had been over, we brought Alan Davey, our chief executive, into a conversation, and I think around the table at that time was Laura Dyer, Andrea Stark, Jim Tuff and me as the executive board members who were particularly interested. And at the end of the meeting, we'd been incredibly enthused, and Alan suddenly turned around with a look on his face and said, "Oh my God, I'm surrounded by community activists." I think there is, and there was in this country, a generation of people who have grown up with community arts practice at the heart of what they've done for quite a long time. To a certain extent, I think that went quiet for all sorts of reasons to do with the type of mentality we have. I'm not inviting revolution, let's just make it clear, but I think there is the beginning of the emergence again of that kind of activism voice, which doesn't see arts practice as divorced from a connectivity to social practice.
You know, what is the role of culture in combating inequality in society? And Moira said just now, I'd not like to encourage revolution, but why not?
For me, great arts practice and social change are actually inextricably linked. At various moments in time here, we lose that conversation. I don't think we lose the practice necessarily, but we lose the ability to articulate that in a way that we all feel comfortable with. And so I would like to, if I'm not going to encourage revolution, I would certainly like to encourage that conversation to be vocal, to be visible and vocal.
Célio,
Sim. De fato, precisamos entender a formulação da ideia do ponto de cultura no contexto que o Brasil viveu na primeira década desse século.
So in fact, we have to understand the policy of points of culture in the context that it happened in Brazil in the end of the beginning of the century.
Como creio que todos devem saber, o Brasil é país muito desigual.
As you probably know, Brazil is a very unequal country.
Não é país pobre, é país rico.
It's not a poor country, it's a very rich country.
Mas muito desigual.
But very, very unequal.
Se reduziu pouco isso nos últimos 10 anos.
It's not that bad as it were before, but
Mas a diferença.
Still, the differences are great.
A pergunta que sempre me fiz, como eu sou historiador de formação,
My background as an historian,
é porque país como tão desigual e convivendo com tanta riqueza como o Brasil, ele não chegou a realizar uma revolução, uma ruptura profunda.
why I ask this question as a historian, why in a country with so much wealth and so much inequality, why never there was a big revolution in this country?
E como não se esgarçou socialmente de uma forma mais intensa.
And why the social fabric wasn't completely disrupted in this country in a very violent way if there is so much inequality?
Que talvez possa ocorrer no contexto atual,
Which may at some point happen, of course,
porque os acontecimentos da luta social do último ano me têm levado a rever alguns conceitos.
Because in the last year, the social developments in Brazil have made me rethink some things.
Mas enfim, o que eu percebi, exatamente por ser país tão iníquo, tão desigual, ele se manteve a partir de redes de solidariedade subterrâneas.
So, but I think that just exactly because there's so much inequality, the country was kept together by these invisible networks of solidarity.
Essas redes criaram processos de criatividade muito intensos.
And these networks created creative processes that were very intense.
Foram construídas ao longo de algumas décadas.
And they were built along a few decades.
Por exemplo, o círculo, que dá origem ao ponto, foi praticado por Paulo Freire, um educador brasileiro, antes do golpe militar de 1964.
So this idea of
O círculo que eu uso havia.
So this idea of using the circle as a point.
Foi uma experiência iniciada antes do golpe militar de 1964.
Was an experience by Paulo Freire, which was experimented before the military dictatorship in Brazil in the 60s.
Para programas de educação popular, de alfabetização.
And it was used for programs for popular education and literacy.
Então, essas experiências invisibilizadas, elas emergiram nesse novo contexto.
So these experiences that happened at some point, but that were not sustainable at some point, they re-emerged again in this policy.
Creio que também sintetizadas pela presença de um presidente como o presidente Lula, que carrega em sua história a história do próprio povo.
Also because of this figure of this president Lula, who actually carries in himself the story, the recent history of the people.
Com isso, as pessoas acreditaram mais nelas.
So people also believed in themselves more than before.
Aqui não falo do ponto de vista político-partidário, mas do ponto de vista simbólico.
I'm not talking about this partidarity or the party vision, but the symbolic thing that happened.
Esse simbolismo propiciou esse novo ambiente.
So this symbol that he was very beneficial for this process.
Mas a história sempre carrega contradições.
But in history there were always contradictions.
E agora a nossa grande contradição está exatamente entre uma ideia de realizar a inclusão social a partir do consumo e do endividamento das famílias.
And now the idea in Brazil of fighting, doing social inclusion is coming from creating debt in the families, and consumism. Yeah.
Que pode resultar em uma barbárie, ou a partir da emancipação, que só se estabelece pela educação e a cultura.
And the result could be barbaric, or could lead it to a different result, which is autonomy through culture.
Esse é o desafio agora.
So this is the challenge.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, this question about funding. In this country, it's extraordinarily difficult to get money if you don't know what you're doing. And it seems that one of the exciting things about this diagram is we don't know what's going to arise from those collisions and associations. Help.
You mean you have to have a defined programme of activity
Exactly,
in
you
order to
almost
get
have to do that rather than that.
Accountability, I guess, is the issue.
I think that's valid. I've got Arts Council colleagues in the room, so I'm just checking every so often with them that I'm not saying something totally outrageous. But I think you're right to a certain extent that the way the Arts Council's funded in the time that I've been there has required people to express the output as well as the outcome that they're seeking. I hope we're changing that to a certain extent, certainly with some of our funding models. So the Creative People and Places programme, for example, absolutely set the big picture that we wanted to be part of, but we had no sense of how that, we still don't have any sense of how that's going to be achieved, and we've left that very much to the consortia on the ground to develop in co-production with communities and to come back and talk to us at various points in time. But it's not us releasing the funding dependent on a production or an exhibition at all, because we recognise that would completely be counterintuitive to what we wanted to achieve with that programme. I think there is there are issues around accountability and risk there. And talking risk with our governing body is something we're doing very actively at the moment. Particularly when money is tight, I think the challenge for us as funders and for other funders is actually to become even more directive about what we want to see. And really we've got to become less directive about what we want to see, and also recognise that the partnership that we need to create collectively with other people who fund means that our objectives can't overshadow the objectives of other people who are part of that mix. It's learning for us, I think, and certainly for our governing bodies as well, to remind them that there is a creative process at the heart, which is risky and to a certain extent undefinable on a regular beat is really important.
I think we've come to the end of our time. Was that right, Margaret? I thought you were looking like that. But actually, finishing on that idea of taking risks and thinking about the unexpected part of creativity is probably the right place to end. I would like to thank Célio and Moira and of course Paul very much for some fascinating contributions. To thank Andre for his excellent translation throughout. It's been going on seamlessly. And of course to thank the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for the book, which we all really value, and for organising this event. So I think it's been a really successful and interesting afternoon. And finally, thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.